Hello, and welcome back to this week's episode of How to Attain Enlightenment. My name is Erica Blackbear, and I will be your host. Today's episode, we are going to talk about one of my guides. I mentioned him in the last episode. His name is Dr. George. As a child, I was always very spiritually inclined, and I was very interested in the spiritual realm. I was always communicating with beings on the other side, and there was just something that really interested me. One of the really beautiful things about my upbringing, I was raised with a spiritual component, open-minded spiritually. So I wasn't raised Christian. And the beliefs that I was raised with were, you could say, a combination between Hindu and Buddhist, a little bit of Christianity, and Native American or tribal beliefs and traditions. So my parents' guru's name was Dr. George. He unfortunately passed before I was born. He was an enlightened master. He was a direct disciple of Paramahansa Yogananda. And so growing up, I heard countless stories about both Dr. George and Paramahansa Yogananda. I think I got my first copy of the autobiography when I was like 10. The Autobiography of a Yogi by Paramahansa Yogananda is what I'm referring to. Anyway, and so this really shaped that, you know what, it really gave me hope is what it did, because I experienced such darkness as a child, and access to this information, it was the light that got me through the darkest of times in my life. I just remember being enthralled by the stories. Like, I just could not get enough information about Dr. George and about Yogananda, and I just wanted to know about enlightenment. How do you attain enlightenment? I just wanted to know everything. And my parents, had a limited understanding of everything, but what I did learn was based off of my mom's firsthand experience with Dr. George directly. Dr. George had, I'm going to say it in a particular way, had found my parents before I was born. And I say it that way because that is what happened. Dr. George was meant to be my guru, but he had an untimely death, unfortunately. Perhaps I will get into what happened with that in another podcast episode, but I don't want to focus on that now. I know this now, that he was supposed to be my guru, but as a child, I didn't know that. And I had this deep hole, you could call it, in my heart because I longed for a guru. I wanted a spiritual mentor, somebody that could show me the way, that was a real holy person, not somebody who just regurgitates things that they've heard. I wanted somebody who walked the talk, who had lived the experiences of attaining enlightenment and who could actually show me the way. And I longed for that in-person relationship and connection. So Dr. George still has been a spiritual mentor for me from, his vantage point on the other side, so to speak, and he's on my guide team. Now, one of the stories that my mom always told me when I was a kid was when I was 3 years old, I was laying kind of across her lap, and she was sitting in a chair, and there was a window behind her, and I kept looking up above, like in the corner of the window, and I was talking and giggling and laughing to somebody, and my mom was confused. And so she asked me, "Who are you talking to?" And I said, "Dr. George." I had not been really told about Dr. George at this point. I mean, I was 3. My mom was really taken aback by the whole thing. And so she told me about this multiple times throughout my life. It's just one example of the way that Dr. George has really just been an integral part of my life still. Okay, so I said he was a direct disciple of Paramahansa Yogananda. He did attain enlightenment. He was an enlightened master. And he wasn't from Wisconsin, which is where I grew up. I grew up in the Milwaukee area of Wisconsin. He wasn't from Wisconsin originally, but he came to Wisconsin, like I said, to find my parent. When there's a guru-disciple relationship, it crosses lifetimes. And so Dr. George would have been my guru in other lifetimes as well, because he was coming to be my guru in this lifetime. And so it's like I was born with the understanding that I was going to have that guru disciple relationship in this lifetime. And I just, like I said, I crave it. I long for it. I still to this day do. It's one of the major things that drives me. Dr. George was a very unusual person. If you came across him on the street, you might think that he is a homeless person, or, because he would dress very unusually, like his clothes were mismatched. He would always have different mismatched socks on. He had all of his clothes had paint stains on them, or patches in them, and they were just old and worn out. And he had a very goofy style. Nothing really matched, but yet he pulled it together, is my impression of it, kind of thing. So coming across him on the street, you would not know that he was such a holy man if you weren't attuned in that way. And I really believe it was an intentional thing. It was almost like his own way of rebelling against where he saw society heading, which is very materialistic and very focused on external, instead of realizing that it's what's internal that matters. So it was kind of like a big FU to society with how he dressed and how he acted. He was very rebellious. He was an outcast, you could say. It was almost like he was an outlaw in some sense of the word. And the things that he did was just not normal or acceptable in society. He had a very difficult upbringing. He was orphaned, I think, by the time he was 8 years old or something. This I learned just recently about him. He would own property, and then he would get scrap lumber and create these house structures or things on the property that they were never up to code. Like, they weren't made properly how someone would normally build a house. He just haphazardly threw things together. It was just one of his quirks. And some of his disciples, so it wasn't just my parents. I grew up with a whole kind of community of these people who had lived with Dr. George. So Dr. George had you could say a commune or an ashram in Wisconsin. So there was one in Adams Friendship, Wisconsin, but there was another one. I think he had other properties in the Milwaukee area, and the property he owned in the Milwaukee area, it was condemned by the city. I don't know what year it was, but they condemned it, and for 20 or 30 years or something, the city was trying to evict him out of the property, and they never accomplished that. He held onto this property, which was a miracle by itself. And this is a story that was told by another disciple that were my parents' friends. So I grew up hearing about all of these stories about this man, and I was just completely enthralled with the stories. I'll reiterate some of the stories that my mom told me about him that she experienced directly. So my mom, I think she met him in her early 20s. I think she was at college age, and she was going to go with some friends on a road trip to California. Dr. George told her a couple of times not to go on this road trip, and she couldn't figure out why. And then the night before, she just could not sleep, and she had really bad feelings, and she just kept thinking, I do not feel good about this. And so she decided to tell her friends, I'm not going to go with you. And they went on their road trip to California, and they lost control of a vehicle and went off a cliff, and everybody in the car died. And so essentially Dr. George saved her life. and saved her life multiple times. There was another situation where, now the specifics of it are a little bit hazy, but the general idea of the story, I know I have that right. So the area in Wisconsin they were in had a lot of 2-lane highways, so one lane going one way and one lane going the other way, and they were going somewhere, and Dr. George was driving, I believe. Maybe he was sitting in the front seat and my mom was driving. I don't know exactly how the seating arrangement was, but I believe there was somebody else in the car with them too. And they were going down this highway, and this big truck veered into their lane and was heading head on for them and going very fast. So they were both going like 50, 60 plus miles an hour. And my mom said that when the truck was about a foot or two away from hitting dead on with their vehicle, she closed her eyes and braced for the impact, and the impact never came. And then she opened her eyes. The truck was behind them in the right lane, and Dr. George just had a smile on his face. So she said she never knew if he levitated one of the vehicles over the other one, how he made it happen. But she said when she closed her eyes, there was not enough time for either of the vehicles to swerve out of the way. It was too close. And so the head-on was imminent and assured, and it never happened. And then there was another story of she was outside his vehicle or somebody's vehicle, and she had her hand in the door jammer on the roof, and somebody slammed the door shut, and it was the old big body metal cars, and it cut her hand all the way to the bone. So she opened the door, and it was bleeding really bad. She would have needed to have stitches, potentially surgery for sure. She said she never felt any pain, and Dr. George came over and placed her hand in between his hands just for a couple minutes and just stood there with his eyes closed, and all she felt was just this love and peace come over her. And when he took his hands away, her hand was completely healed. There was nothing, not even a scar. There was another story that my mom's best friend, who also lived at the commune with him, this was like right before he left his body. He was in the hospital, and she went to visit him. She was leaving the room for some reason. I don't know if she was leaving for the night or if she was going to go grab something to eat, or I don't know exactly, but she had her back to him, and all of a sudden she heard him saying in a voice that didn't really sound like his, and she turned around and he was levitating off the bed, and just this light was coming from him, and he was just levitating and just had this very peaceful look on his face. And I believe it was either that night or the next morning that he actually left his body, passed away. And so I grew up hearing all of these miraculous stories about this holy man. And my parents always had a meditation room in in any house. We lived in 2 different houses when I was a kid, and in both the houses we had a meditation room, and we always had the picture of Dr. George on the altar. So Dr. George, before he passed, he had started a church, what we called the church, in Milwaukee, and he was the minister or whatever of the church, but it wasn't a Christian church. It was a branch of the Self-Realization Fellowship Church, which is the organization that Paramahansa Yogananda began. And because he was a disciple of Yogananda, he was able to start a Self-Realization Fellowship Church. Unfortunately, like I said, he passed before I was born, so I never got to hear him speak in the church. When I went, it was mostly my father's uncle who was the minister there. And so I went there up until I was about 10. When we moved houses, we went to that church regularly. And the thing that I remember most about that church was there was the Sunday school or the kids area downstairs, and I never wanted to be down there because I always wanted to be with the adults in the church. And not that I was really very much into the preaching aspect of it, because I knew that the people that were preaching were not particularly holy men. I wasn't getting a lot out of what they were saying and how they were saying it. But I remember they would often tell stories about Dr. George, but the other thing that really was a big part of it for me was that after the sermon, they would chant the Om and sit in meditation for, it felt like hours, but it must have been about an hour. That was my absolute favorite part of the whole thing. And I was actually really kind of sad when we stopped going to the church, because I loved sitting in that vibration, that chanting of the Om, and I loved being in meditation. And, you know, it was another thing where it affected me on such a level. It was like a remembering almost for me, that the Om chanting, it just took me somewhere else. I just absolutely loved it. Dr. George has always been like an integral part of my life. I've always felt very connected to him. Like I said, he's on my guide team. I have always felt that connection, and I felt this deep, deep sadness that I did not know him in life, and that I wasn't able to learn from him. And I just have this sadness about it. During my teens and 20s, I kind of was just very busy with life, and I got away from my spirituality a little bit. It was always there. It was always part of my life, but I wasn't actively participating in it necessarily. I have reconnected with Dr. George more recently, and I feel like he is still meant to be my spiritual teacher. Another interesting thing is that when I was a teenager, I was looking for something in my mom's closet, and I came across this sweater that I'm wearing right now. And I just was very attracted to the sweater. I don't know why. It's such a weird looking, kind of ugly sweater. It's very 70s and not really my current style, but just I wanted this sweater. And there's mismatched buttons on it. It's just really silly. And there's missing a button. And I went to my mom and I'm like, can I have this sweater? And she was kind of like, oh, that's Dr. George's sweater. And she finally gave it to me after me just begging her for it for a long time. And so she finally gave it to me, and I've had it ever since. And I used to wear it more in the past, but I just wanted to wear it for the video because I thought it just shows his style and personality very much. And there's like paint on it, you know, it's just a Dr. George sweater. And my mom said that he used to wear this sweater all the time. So I've had this sweater, and I had it in a storage box recently. I put it in there with some other things, and one of the other things that I had in there was this pound block of cacao. So I had gone on a yoga retreat to Lake Atitlan in Guatemala a couple years ago. We had done a cacao ceremony, and they used this particular cacao that was made by the indigenous people there, and it was just incredible. And I loved this cacao. So I bought a bunch of blocks and I brought it home, and I had intentionally bought too much in order to sell some of it to other people. And so I had this one block of cacao left. I had the cacao in with this sweater, and I listed it on Facebook Marketplace, and this guy contacted me about it, and this guy wanted to have a call. And I was like, okay, that's unusual. I was kind of busy. It's funny because when he called, somehow we got on the subject. Oh, I remember, because he's living at an Ananda group, or he used to, that is just down the road from where I'm currently living. So he brought that up. And so I, just mentioned that I have a connection to Yogananda. And so we started chatting about it. And then I brought up Dr. George, and I explained who he was. Told him, it's funny that this should come up, because the sweater that I have of Dr. George's was literally in the box, and there was only probably like 3 or 4 things in this particular box that I had, and the cacao was in there with this sweater. And that's just kind of interesting that this should all come up. And I didn't know it, but while we were on the phone chatting, he's looking up Dr. George. And I explained to him, when I was younger, probably early 20s, I looked him up online, and I was just trying to get more information about who he was as a person. And literally there was nothing online about him. I could not find one single thing, not on the Yogananda website, not on YouTube, nothing. And as I'm talking and explaining this to him, he starts sending me links. One of them was a link from the Self-Realization Fellowship organization that had Dr. George listed as one of the disciples of Yogananda that had attained enlightenment, and that Yogananda had verified had attained enlightenment while Yogananda was still alive. I thought that was really interesting. They had a kind of a bio about Dr. George on there, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is so cool. He also sent me a number of YouTube videos where some of the disciples of Dr. George had videoed themselves in it must have been early 90s, sharing stories about Dr. George and what it was like to live with him and what it was like to experience being around him. And somebody had uploaded it onto YouTube long after the fact. This was, probably within the last few years. And so now there's all this information, and I wouldn't have found it because I wouldn't have thought to look him up. And I'm sure Dr. George made all this happen. It's not coincidence. How is the cacao in with this sweater randomly, and then this guy has a connection to Yogananda, and he looks, it's just interesting how that all came about, and I just found it very heartwarming. And it was interesting too, because I was looking at the Dr. George on the Yogananda website, and then I saw that they were having their yearly convocation, and they do multiple long meditations every day. And I was really at a point, so I meditate regularly, I meditate daily, and I'm also a Kundalini yoga practitioner, and I'm also certified to teach Kundalini levels 2 and 3 and Hatha yoga level 2. So I practice a lot of yoga. And a couple years ago, I got into Kundalini yoga because it's more breath work, and it is the point of the asana, the body movement part of yoga, because yoga isn't only what the asana is. That's what people refer to as yoga, but that's not what yoga is. Yoga also includes meditation, which is the number one thing, and the asana is you're only prescribed to do the asana in order to be able to sit comfortably for long periods in meditation so that you can attain enlightenment. Anyway, so the point is that I've been a practitioner of Kundalini yoga for a number of years, probably going on close to 3 years now. And I also practice meditation. More recently, I've dove more into the meditation, and I felt like I had hit kind of a plateau with my meditation, and I was wanting to go further and get more techniques and get more tools on how to advance to attain enlightenment. But I mean, just in my meditation practice, which leads to that, obviously, right before all this had happened, where I was came across this guy and I sold him this cacao and all that, I had been kind of putting it out into the universe. I would like to get more tools to use in my meditation practice to deepen into my meditation, because I was introduced to this guy who then showed me these links of Dr. George. I came across on the Self-Realization Fellowship website that they were doing this convocation, which is a 10-day and they have multiple longer meditations, kirtan, the devotional singing and chanting, and then, deepening the understanding. So I had already gotten the lessons, the Paramahansa Yogananda lessons, and so I was practicing some of the meditation techniques that he puts in there. But then the convocation really helped to deepen that and sent me back to the lessons to learn the meditation techniques and to deepen the techniques. And I participated in the convocation for the 10 days, and I just got a lot out of it. And it was just such a reinvigoration of my spiritual practices. And this all happened because of this interesting path where I was learning about Dr. George. that has led me to apply for Kriya Yoga. I feel like I've plateaued with my Kundalini Yoga as well. And so I'm ready for the next level. And I feel like the Kriya Yoga is the next level, which is through the Self-Realization Fellowship organization. So it's all really come full circle for me. And I just find it so interesting how it happened, because I really feel like Dr. George was leading me the whole way to this. The other interesting thing is I was sitting in meditation during the convocation, and I just had this download, which happens to me frequently, where I get a packet of information quickly. I had been also putting it out there, and I'll get more into this because there's more to the story, but I had been putting it out there. Okay, I really would like a guru in the physical world. I feel like it's time for me to have a guru. I'm on this direct path to enlightenment at this point, and I really would like to know who my guru is and to connect with them. I also know that I am going to be going to India very soon. I don't know exactly when. I am just following my guidance, which I will again get more into. There's a lot of prongs to this story, but I do know that I will be going to India. And when I was a young child, I always had visions of going to India and meeting my guru there. And I also know, side note, that my divine counterpart, my future husband, is also in India. I know that, and that'll be the next podcast. I'm actually going to get more into the story around him. And so I had been putting it out there. I really need a guru. I want to be in the presence of a guru who can model to me the energetics of where I'm headed so that I can more easily get there, and who can also help me to understand the changes that need to happen within me in order to allow that to happen. Because it's more of an allowing than a striving when you're attaining enlightenment. I was sitting in meditation during the convocation, and I kind of got this awareness that Dr. George is going to be the guru. And I feel like it is going to be in the physical. Now, I don't know for a fact that that's what's happening, but that seems to be what the download was sharing with me. And I'm awaiting more information. Guides, please give me more information. I'm awaiting more information on it, but that was the understanding, and that was my understanding when I started to understand more and more that Dr. George was and still is supposed to be my guru, that he has been my guru in other lifetimes, and that death isn't going to keep it from happening, kind of thing. I'm going to leave this episode here. I feel like I've shared everything that I wanted to share about Dr. George and just my relationship with him and how much he has touched my life, and he's really given me hope. This man, this being has given me hope in my darkest hours. He has been one of the beings that has stuck with me through those darkest moments and made me feel loved, made me feel his presence, and I will forever be grateful to him for that. And I am excited to see what happens with this relationship with this being in the future, and I'm excited to share the developments as they happen. So thank you for tuning in to this week's episode, and I will see you next week.